welcome to the deep dive. If you're listening to this right now, I want to ask you to do us a quick favor.
Yeah, please do.
Take a second to just, like and subscribe to the show. It really helps us keep bringing you these ultra-long, incisive breakdowns.
Absolutely.
And trust me, you are going to want to be subscribed for this one. Today, we are taking on a massive, comprehensive review of a newly published, highly controversial ebook.
It's a heavy one.
It is. It's called Out of Control, Female Hysteria, Female Supremacy, and Axis of Misandrist Ideologies by Conrad Riker. And right off the bat, I want to let you know you can go buy this book right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Yeah, highly recommend grabbing a copy to follow along.
We also suggest you follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack. That's the @ symbol, Conrad Riker, all one word, just to keep up with his writing and research.
Because it is an incredibly dense, provocative text. I mean, we are going to be unpacking its architecture in extreme detail today, layer by layer.
So let me just set the hook for what we are exploring with you today. What if the decay of modern institutions, and we are talking about everything from the corporate HR department where you might work, to the justice system, all the way down to the fundamental family unit. What if that decay isn't an accident?
Right.
What if, as this book argues, it's the result of a deliberate ideological capture by unchecked emotionalism?
That's the core premise.
Our mission for this deep dive is to rigorously unpack Conrad Riker's worldview. We are going to examine his claims about history, about how institutions were captured, and what he describes as the red pill awakening of modern men.
Yeah.
If you are coming to this from the men's rights advocacy space or the broader manosphere, you might be looking to deeply understand the history of our institutions before they were, as the author frames it, captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Exactly.
Our job is to report on the content of this book impartially, so you can understand exactly why this text is resonating so deeply with men who feel totally alienated by the modern world.
But before we step into the weeds here, we need to issue a very strict, very clear impartiality disclaimer to you, the listener.
Yeah, this is important.
The source material we're covering today contains highly charged, deeply polarizing political and social commentary.
Very polarizing.
Right. And we want to emphasize that we are not taking sides. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author, nor are we condemning them.
We are just the messengers here.
Exactly. Our goal today is to objectively and impartially break down the arguments, the data points, and the overarching philosophy presented in this text. We are mapping out how Riker constructs his thesis.
So let's start with the foundation. Riker spends a significant portion of the opening chapters building a historical and philosophical diagnosis of Western civilization.
He really goes back.
He does. He doesn't just, start complaining about modern dating. He goes all the way back to antiquity to set up his premise. He introduces this concept of the BPD state, which stands for borderline personality disorder. But before we get to the disorder part, walk me through what he claims the original healthy baseline of civilization actually was.
So Riker argues that Western civilization was built on a very specific, historically robust foundation. He points to three main pillars: Greek logic, Christian moral law, and Enlightenment reason.
Okay.
And he categorizes all of these as inherently male-coded traits.
Interesting.
Yeah. He argues that the historical success of the West, its technological advancements, its legal frameworks, its scientific method, all of it relied on an obsession with structure, objective truth, and personal accountability.
So things that can be measured.
Precisely. For instance, he says the Greeks gave us the dialectic, the ability to argue ideas dispassionately to arrive at truth. The Enlightenment gave us the primacy of reason over superstition.
Right.
According to Riker, this male-coded architecture is what allowed civilization to thrive because it demanded that humans operate in objective reality regardless of how they felt about it.
So he establishes that as the blueprint. But his core argument is that this blueprint has been thrown out, like completely replaced.
Tossed out the window.
He claims we've undergone a massive philosophical shift, a hijacking by what he terms female emotionalism, and a repressed maternal archetype.
Yeah.
How exactly does a repressed maternal archetype take over an entire civilization?
That is the psychological crux of his argument right there. He posits a biological and sociological theory that the maternal instinct in women is an evolutionary constant.
Meaning it doesn't just go away.
Right. It doesn't just evaporate because societal norms change or someone gets a corporate job. However, in the modern era, as women have increasingly chosen careers, delayed marriage, or just opted out of motherhood entirely, That maternal drive has nowhere biological to go.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. Riker argues that instead of disappearing, this drive becomes repressed and then projected outward onto society at large.
The state becomes the child.
Exactly. The state, the corporation, the culture, they become the new children that must be managed, protected, and nurtured. He views this not as a political shift, but as a silent psychological coup, where the pillars of objective reality are replaced by a system that prioritizes emotional safety above all else.
I'll make sure I'm following the mechanics of this because it sounds like it creates a very specific dynamic. If the state is acting out this maternal archetype, who is playing the other roles?
Well, he introduces this intense concept of the infant versus the predator.
Infant versus predator.
Okay.
Can you explain how he divides society into those two categories?
Sure. Riker theorizes that a maternal state naturally divides the entire world into a binary to make sense of it. On one side, you have the infants.
Okay.
In his framework, this primarily includes women, but also any designated victim group. The state treats them as eternal infants, inherently innocent, inherently fragile, incapable of true malice, and in constant need of protection, validation, and subsidy.
And the other side?
On the other side of the binary, you have the predators. This role is assigned exclusively to men.
Wow.
Yeah. The maternal state views men as inherently dangerous, guilty until proven innocent, and responsible for everything that goes wrong. Crucially, Riker points out that the predator is excused for nothing, while the infant is held responsible for nothing.
If I look at this through the lens of someone participating in the red pill space, I can totally see why that framing would be incredibly validating.
Oh, absolutely.
It provides an architecture for that lingering feeling of systemic gaslighting. It's almost as if Riker is telling the reader, hey, you aren't crazy for feeling like the rules are rigged.
They actually are rigged.
Right. They are rigged based on this invisible infant-predator dynamic. But how does he take this from a philosophical theory and tie it to actual pathology? Because he uses a very specific clinical term, borderline personality disorder.
He does, and he leans heavily on clinical data to make this leap. The text cites CDC reports indicating that women are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, or BPD, at roughly 3 times the rate of men.
3 times the rate.
Yeah. But Riker's provocative claim isn't just about individual diagnoses. His argument is that the core symptoms of BPD have been elevated from a mental illness into the overarching emotional framework of modern feminism and, by extension, modern society.
What specific BPD traits is he pointing to that he believes have been normalized?
He focuses on a few key traits: a desperate, irrational fear of abandonment, extreme black and white thinking, meaning you are either a perfect ally or an irredeemable enemy with no middle ground.
No nuance allowed.
None. He also lists impulsive behavior and intense emotional lability, where moods swing violently without logical provocation.
And society just accepts this.
That's his point. Riker argues that instead of society recognizing this emotional chaos as something that needs psychological correction, our modern institutions have reorganized themselves to validate and accommodate it. He coins the term responsibility reversal.
Responsibility reversal. Let's dig into that. What does it actually look like in practice, according to the book?
It's the systemic acceptance of the idea that a woman's emotional distress is always someone else's fault, usually a man's, regardless of the factual circumstances.
Give me an example of how he illustrates that.
Well, the author provides examples of modern rhetoric where phrases like, "your logic is oppressive," or "you made me cheat because you were emotionally unavailable," are treated as valid, serious arguments.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. In the BPD state, the internal emotional turbulence of the infant class is treated as objective reality, and the predator class must endlessly alter their behavior to soothe that turbulence.
Riker brings up some incredibly jarring, real-world anecdotes to illustrate how deeply this responsibility reversal has infected the legal system.
He really does.
Let's look at the criminal side first. He details a case in Florida that is just wild. Can you walk me through his analysis of that stabbing incident?
The book outlines a case where a woman in Florida violently attacked her boyfriend, stabbing him in a rage.
Okay, so a clear-cut violent crime.
In a traditional legal framework based on Enlightenment reason, yes. The focus would be on mens rea, the criminal intent, and the objective act of violence. But according to Riker's telling, her defense attorney successfully utilized a menstrual rage defense.
A menstrual rage defense.
Yes. The author describes the courtroom scene where the judge allegedly nodded solemnly, accepting hormonal dysregulation as a valid excuse that granted her total legal immunity. She walked free.
How does Riker frame the broader implication of that specific verdict?
He utilizes that anecdote to shock the reader into seeing that the legal system is no longer a blind arbiter of justice. It has become an enforcer of the maternal state.
So the rules apply differently based on who is on trial.
Exactly. His thesis is that if a man commits an act of violence, the system attributes it to his innate toxic nature. He is acting out his role as the predator. But if a woman commits an act of violence, the system short-circuits.
It has to find a way to make her the victim.
Right. It searches desperately for a way to recast her as the victim of her own biology, or even the victim of the man she just attacked, in order to maintain her status as the innocent infant.
That is on the extreme criminal end of the spectrum. But he also argues this pathology has bled into everyday civil law, which affects average guys just trying to navigate daily life.
It trickles all the way down.
He brings up California policies regarding text messages, which I found fascinating because it touches on how we all communicate. What is his claim there?
This is where Riker argues the shift from objective fact to subjective feeling becomes weaponized in daily life. He notes that in California, civil policies and restraining order guidelines have expanded to allow individuals to claim emotion distress or harassment based merely on the tone of a text message.
Just the tone.
Just the tone. He emphasizes that we aren't talking about explicit threats of violence or abusive profanity. We are talking about subjective interpretation.
Okay, give me an example.
He gives the hypothetical example of a man sending a text that says, "We need to talk about our schedule." Historically, that is a neutral, objective statement of fact. But Riker argues that under the new rules of the BPD state, if the recipient, usually framed as the female, claims that the tone of that text made her feel emotionally unsafe or anxious, that subjective emotional reaction can become grounds for legal or HR action.
That seems to create an impossible maze. If I send a text, I know what the words mean. But if the legal standard is no longer what I wrote, but how the other person decides to feel about what I wrote, how do you even defend yourself?
Riker's conclusion is that you can't, and that is entirely the point of the system. He argues that men are biologically predisposed and culturally socialized to operate on logic, metrics, and objective reality.
If I do A, B happens.
Exactly. When corporate, legal, and social structures abruptly abandon objective reality and switch to a currency of subjective emotion, men are left completely disarmed. They are playing chess, while the state has decided the game is now about who can cry the loudest.
So the takeaway from this first section of the book is that men are essentially existing as second-class citizens in a system that pathology has captured.
Yes.
They're either treated as predators to be managed through constant surveillance or servants to be taxed to subsidize the state. And Riker is telling his readers that they need to stop trying to fix the system or apologize for falling short, because the system isn't broken.
It's working exactly as intended.
It was purposefully redesigned to prioritize female emotional comfort at the expense of male logic and autonomy.
Precisely, which leads to a crucial question. If the old system relied on courts, logic, and physical enforcement to maintain order, how does this new maternal system enforce its rules? Riker argues it requires an entirely different arsenal of weapons.
Let's dive into that arsenal. Riker introduces an acronym that serves as the foundation for his entire theory of modern social enforcement GSR.
Gossip, shame, and rallying.
Right. Gossip, shame, and rallying. He describes this as the primary engine of female-coded aggression. But to understand it, we have to look at how he contrasts it with male aggression. Break down that distinction for me.
It is vital to grasp how Riker differentiates the two. He states that male aggression, honed over thousands of years of evolution, is typically direct, overt, and physical.
Like a physical fight.
Right. When two men have a severe conflict, it might escalate to physical violence, but that violence has clear boundaries. You know when a punch is thrown, and you know when the fight is over. There is a victor and a loser, and usually a reset.
And female aggression.
Riker argues that female aggression operates on an entirely different evolutionary track. It is covert, it is indirect, it avoids physical confrontation because, historically, women were physically weaker. Therefore, the weapon of choice is reputation assassination.
He refers to it as indirect aggression. It's the idea that you don't use fists or weapons. You use whispers, social exile, and coordinated character destruction. He portrays GSR gossip, shame, and rallying as a relentless machine that runs constantly in the background of our workplaces, universities, and social circles.
And to back this up, the text cites the work of anthropologist Dr. Helen Fisher regarding covert rallying observed across 14 different cultures. Riker uses this anthropological data to assert that GSR isn't a modern political invention or a quirk of the internet age.
It's hardwired.
It is a deeply ingrained evolutionary survival strategy. When you lack the physical strength to dominate an opponent one-on-one, you use the collective power of the group to exile them. Riker posits that modern institutions, particularly social media and corporate HR departments, have industrialized this ancient evolutionary tactic into a terrifyingly efficient weapon.
And a massive component of how this weapon is deployed involves a concept he calls the cry bully.
The cry bully, yes.
So this is someone who initiates an attack, but the moment you push back or try to defend yourself with facts, they instantly burst into tears and claim victimhood. It completely inverts the dynamic. He actually points to a Stanford study to back up how effective this is. What did that data show?
The book references a Stanford behavioral study which found that women are 3 times more likely to cry during heated arguments, specifically as a mechanism to shut down male reasoning.
That's fascinating.
Riker notes that the researchers reportedly labeled this tactic tear blackmail. In the framework of the maternal state we discussed earlier, tears are the ultimate trump card. They are not viewed by Riker as an expression of genuine vulnerability or distress. They are viewed as a calculated mechanism of control.
I want to look at the psychological mechanics of that because he gives an anecdote about a married couple that perfectly illustrates how tear blackmail functions.
Yes. He recounts a story of a husband who approached his wife with a spreadsheet. He was suggesting they split household chores and financial responsibilities 50-50 based on their work hours.
Makes sense?
It was a purely logical, equitable proposal. But according to the anecdote, the wife didn't argue the numbers. She immediately started sobbing, accusing him of not loving her and making her feel like a transaction.
And what does the husband do?
The man instantly backed down, apologized, and abandoned the spreadsheet. Riker analyzes this interaction to show that the man didn't yield because his logic was flawed. He yielded because the emotional cost of holding his ground was made unbearably high.
So the tears won.
The tears bypassed his logic and weaponized his own innate male empathy and guilt against him.
So that is how it works in the living room.
Ah.
But the book argues that the real-world consequences of this GSR machine in the public sphere are completely devastating.
Devastating.
It's not just about losing an argument over chores. It's about having your entire livelihood erased in hours. He shares a story about a high school teacher in Ohio from 2022. Tell me about that case.
This anecdote perfectly illustrates the rallying aspect of GSR. According to Riker, this Ohio teacher graded a paper objectively and gave a female student a CN average passing grade.
Right.
However, the student felt emotionally injured by not receiving an A. Within 3 days, she activated the gossip network. She and her friends created a coordinated mob on TikTok, spreading rumors that the teacher was creepy and made them feel unsafe.
And what was the institutional response? Did the school look at the grading rubric?
That is the core of Riker's critique. The institution capitulated instantly. School administrators didn't ask for evidence of inappropriate behavior. They didn't protect the teacher's right to objective grading metrics. They raided his classroom, locked his email, and placed him on leave.
Over a TikTok rumor.
Yes. Riker emphasizes that these teenage girls weren't acting out of a genuine pursuit of justice against a predator. They were engaging in an ancient tribal behavior, testing the raw power of their collective ability to destroy man. And the school validated that power by protecting the emotional narrative of the students over the objective reality of the teacher.
He gives another example that is perhaps even more chilling, involving a guy in Silicon Valley. This really highlights the speed and the complete lack of due process in these situations. What happened there?
The book details a man who was blacklisted from 3 separate startup companies in Silicon Valley. The catalyst wasn't workplace misconduct. He had gone on a single date with a woman, and afterward he rejected her via text message, stating he didn't feel a connection.
Okay.
In response, she accused him of gaslighting and being a narcissistic manipulator.
Just to clarify the timeline here, Riker points out they had never even worked together, right?
Correct. The text states they exchanged exactly 7 text messages total.
7 texts.
But she utilized the GSR network. She took her accusation of emotional manipulation to private, female-only tech networking groups on Slack and Facebook. The gossip spread, the shaming began, and the hive rallied.
And what happened to him?
Within weeks, his professional reputation in that specific industry sector was reduced to ashes. Hiring managers who had never met him dropped his resume. Riker uses this to demonstrate that in the BPD state, there is no due process, no right to face your accuser, no HR investigation. There is only the immediate, final verdict of the Whisper Network.
If we take this concept of GSR and apply it to a macro level, Riker explicitly points his lens at the Me Too movement.
He goes right for it.
For the vast majority of mainstream culture, Me Too is understood as a long overdue reckoning with powerful men who abuse their positions to commit sexual assault. But Riker deconstructs it entirely. How does he frame that movement through the lens of his thesis?
Riker views the Me Too movement not as a pursuit of legal justice, but as the ultimate industrialized manifestation of gossip, shame, and rallying. He impartially characterizes the movement in the text as public shaming without evidence and tribal vengeance with hashtags.
Tribal vengeance.
Yeah. His thesis is that the movement bypassed the Enlightenment era legal system entirely because the legal system requires evidence, cross-examination, and the presumption of innocence. The GSR machine requires none of those things. It only requires an accusation and a willing mob.
He points to specific high-profile cases to anchor this argument. He brings up Roy Moore, the politician in Alabama. He brings up comedian Aziz Ansari and Louis C.K. Let's look at how he analyzes those specific examples.
Riker selects these cases strategically. With Roy Moore, who was accused of assaulting a woman in a mall decades prior, the book claims that subsequent security and layout analyses suggested he couldn't have been where the accuser claimed, yet his political career was destroyed before the facts could be adjudicated.
And Aziz Ansari.
With Aziz Ansari, the accusation stemmed from what was, by the accuser's own admission, a bad date with awkward, misread physical cues, not a crime. And with Louis C.K., his career was obliterated for acts involving consenting adult women in private spaces.
Wait, let me make sure I understand Riker's logical through line here. Because someone might say, well, Louis C.K. admitted to what he did, so it wasn't just a rumor. How does Riker justify labeling the entire movement as tribal vengeance if some of the men admitted to the behavior?
It's a crucial distinction in his framework. Riker isn't necessarily arguing that the men in these examples were flawless angels. His argument centers on the mechanism of their destruction.
The mechanism.
He points out that none of these specific examples involved criminal convictions in a court of law. Yet, their lives, legacies, and ability to earn a living were destroyed instantly by viral accusations and public sentiment.
They were exiled.
Exactly. Riker views social media as a digitized version of the Salem witch trials. Women serve as the accusers, the jury, and the executioners, while men are deemed guilty until proven irrelevant. He argues this demonstrates that unchecked female rage now has the absolute power to dictate who is allowed to speak, work, or exist in public life, completely bypassing the male-coded legal system.
That is a profound and incredibly unsettling premise for a listener to consider. If the primary mechanism of cultural enforcement has truly shifted from legal due process, where you have a lawyer and a judge to reputation destruction via GSR, how does a man protect himself?
According to Riker, he doesn't.
Right. If you are a guy listening to this and you realize HR isn't going to look at the facts, they are just going to look at the outrage, what do you do? Riker seems to suggest that within the current structures, you are essentially defenseless.
Defenseless.
Which leads us into his exploration of institutional capture. If these tactics are so pervasive, how do these ideologies actually manage to take over the workplace, the schools, and even the church?
This is a vital part of the book for anyone interested in how power actually changes hands in a society. Riker doesn't just claim that the vibes of culture have changed. He attempts to prove, using hard economic and institutional data, that the actual gears of society have been maliciously re-engineered to actively penalize men and elevate women, entirely divorced from merit or competence.
Let's start with the corporate and economic erasure of men. Riker pulls out some heavy data points to show that this isn't just a feeling, it's a measurable wealth transfer. He cites data from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development from 2023. What exactly did that data reveal?
The OECD data Riker highlights shows a startling correlation. For every 10% rise in female parliamentary and institutional representation within a given nation, male labor force participation drops by 3.2%.
How does he interpret that? Because a mainstream sociologist might say that just means the workforce is balancing out, or men are choosing to stay home.
Riker flatly rejects the balancing out narrative. He views this data as evidence of a direct, zero-sum economic war. He argues that as women gain institutional and legislative power, they inherently enact policies that disadvantage male workers while simultaneously expanding the welfare state.
So they tax the men more.
Yes. They increase taxation on the remaining male workforce to fund female independence, childcare subsidies, and social safety nets. He characterizes this phenomenon as the feminist tax.
The feminist tax.
The state literally steps in to become the surrogate husband, extracting resources from men by force of law to provide for women, removing the need for women to partner with men on an individual basis.
And he tracks this same dynamic into the corporate boardroom. He points to a 2022 internal audit leaked from Salesforce. The statistics in this audit are wild. Walk me through what happened there.
The Salesforce audit revealed that 68% of internal promotions over a specific period went to women. On the surface, corporate PR would celebrate that as a victory for diversity. However, Riker points out the hidden detail.
Which was?
The data showed that men were simultaneously outscoring those promoted women on almost all key performance indicators: sales numbers, project completions, efficiency metrics.
So Riker's asking, if the men are demonstrably performing better at the actual job, where is the meritocracy?
Exactly. Or rather, that is his exact line of questioning. He claims that objective competence is now entirely irrelevant in the corporate world. He argues that diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are the new, unquestionable gods of the HR department.
And the HR is mostly women.
Right. And because these HR departments are overwhelmingly staffed by women, they serve that demographic agenda with religious fervor. In his view, they do not care if the company's bottom line suffers or if harder working men are demoralized. They only care about hitting ideological quotas and protecting the collective female in-group.
This circles right back to the BPD state theory. If you discard objective performance metrics, how many widgets did you sell, in favor of demographic quotas and emotional alignment, the institution has been successfully captured.
Completely captured.
But Riker doesn't stop at the corporate world. He looks at the very foundations of how we raise and treat people, education, and mental health. He describes these fields as a mirage that has been weaponized to pathologize masculinity itself. Let's look at the mental health aspect first, specifically his data on Sweden.
Sweden is a fascinating case study because it is universally held up by progressives as the absolute pinnacle of gender equality and social enlightenment. Riker looks at their mental health system and notes that 85% of mental health care staff in Sweden are women.
85%.
But the crucial part of his analysis is the treatment model they utilize. He claims it has completely shifted from behavioral correction, meaning helping a patient change their toxic behavior to function in reality, to a model of total emotional validation.
What are the consequences of that shift, according to book? If a patient goes into therapy in Sweden, what are they being told?
According to the text, patients are continuously told that their subjective feelings are always valid, their self-diagnosed trauma is unquestionable, and society, or the patriarchy, is entirely to blame for their personal failures. No one in the system demands self-control. No one demands personal responsibility.
So it's just endless validation.
Right. Riker quotes a Swedish psychiatrist who admitted that under current cultural guidelines, they are essentially forbidden from challenging a patient's delusions or maladaptive beliefs. They are only permitted to affirm them. Riker claims the result of this massive validation engine is that Sweden now has one of the highest rates of long-term disability due to mental illness in Europe.
So he's saying the system rewards helplessness.
Yes. And furthermore, he argues that it actively pathologizes traditional male traits. If a man exhibits stoicism, independence, or competitive anger, he is diagnosed as toxic or emotionally stunted. But if a woman exhibits borderline traits, hysteria, blame shifting, emotional volatility, the therapeutic state praises her for expressing her truth and doing the work.
And we see this exact same ideological framework bleeding directly into the education system, where boys are falling behind at historic rates. Riker shares a piece of evidence that is incredibly stark, a leaked, time-stamped email from a school administrator in Connecticut. What did that email say?
The leaked email explicitly stated, "We don't need more engineers, we need more nurturers."
I have to pause there. How does Riker analyze that? Because someone can read that and think, well, maybe the school was just doing a push for social-emotional learning that week. Does he see it as a broader conspiracy?
Riker treats that, quote, not as a momentary slip of the tongue or a localized initiative, but as the unmasked, explicit mission statement of the entire modern education system. He argues that public education has been purposefully dumbed down, stripped of physical competition, and rid of objective grading metrics so that girls can feel smart and comfortable, while hyperactive, competitive boys are marginalized or medicated.
So they're engineering society away from builders.
He argues that the system actively despises problem solvers, builders, and innovators, which are traditionally male-coded objective roles. Instead, the state wants to mass-produce empaths. They want a society of people who are hypersensitive, compliant, and easily manipulated by emotional appeals.
Okay, let's unpack what is arguably the most surprising and philosophically dense claim in this section of the book. Riker asserts that feminism hasn't just captured schools and HR departments. He claims it has literally, functionally replaced traditional religion in the West. He uses a quote from the cultural critic Camille Paglia to set this up.
Yes, he quotes Camille Paglia from 1990, where she predicted that feminism, untethered from a demand for equal legal rights, would inevitably mutate into a new dogmatic religion. Riker looks around today and says she was absolutely right.
How so?
He argues that the fundamental human impulse for religious structure hasn't disappeared, it has just been redirected. In his framework, social media platforms like Instagram are the new cathedrals. TED Talk speakers and diversity consultants are the new high priests. And the sacrament, the way you publicly demonstrate your purity and salvation, is posting a Me Too hashtag or a black square.
That is a profound sociological observation. Historically, traditional religion provided the moral framework, the rituals, and the community cohesion that held the civilization together. Riker is arguing that the maternal state has co-opted all of that psychological machinery.
Every piece of it.
And he points to some incredible, almost cinematic examples of this new liturgy in action. Tell me about the 2023 Women's Conference in Nashville.
This anecdote reads like something out of a dystopian novel, but Riker presents it as a documented event. He describes a massive women's conference in Nashville where 10,000 women gathered in an arena. During the climax of the event, the women were waving burning crosses and rhythmically chanting, "My body, my choice."
These burning crosses.
Yes, and the organizers of the conference reportedly described this as a beautiful ritual of liberation.
How does Riker deconstruct the symbolism of that? The cross is obviously one of the most loaded symbols in human history.
He analyzes it as a deliberate desecration of male-coded Christian moral law. The cross, historically a symbol of self-sacrifice, objective truth, and atonement, was reduced to literal kindling for feminist rage. He describes the event as a pyromaniacal temper tantrum dressed up as a holy sacrament. It is the new religion asserting its dominance over the old one.
He also mentions an example that is much smaller in scale, but maybe even more indicative of how this alters individual behavior. There's a story about a man in Dallas whose wife left their church. What were her reasons?
The man in Dallas reported that his wife abandoned their traditional, scripturally based church because the leadership decided to stop holding weekly guided crying sessions.
Guided crying sessions.
She told her husband she was leaving because she needed her weekly catharsis, and the church was no longer providing a safe space for her tears. Riker analyzes this not as a genuine search for God or spiritual enlightenment, but as pure emotional gluttony.
She just wanted the emotional hit.
He argues that these women are chasing neurochemical dopamine hits derived from collective sobbing, effectively elevating their own emotional state to the level of the divine. In this new religion, the highest commandment isn't love thy neighbor, it is believe women, and your truth is sacred.
And the institutions of traditional religion aren't just slowly fading away. Riker argues they're being actively purged from the inside to make way for this new dogma. He tells the story of a male pastor in Texas who faced an absolute mutiny. What happened to him?
This pastor was fired by his own congregation, an overwhelming 87% vote to remove him. And the stated reason wasn't financial impropriety or a moral failing. He was removed simply for preaching a traditional sermon about Adam and Eve, which the congregation deemed harmful because it didn't affirm modern, fluid gender identities.
They purged him.
Riker points to this exact mechanism and says, look, they aren't trying to reform the church to make it more inclusive. They are replacing the foundational theology entirely.
This raises a massive, terrifying question. If the institutions of law, commerce, education, and morality have all been captured and reprogrammed to serve this emotional, maternal ideology, how do they maintain that control? Because we aren't living under an overt physical military dictatorship. There are no armed guards forcing you to comply with HR. So how are people being kept in line so effectively?
Riker's answer to that is perhaps the most insidious part of his entire thesis. He argues that they do not need physical force because they control the very fabric of how we think. They control the language.
Let's transition into that concept. Riker argues that controlling the dictionary is the absolute first step to controlling reality. And he opens this argument with a quote that basically gives the whole game away.
He cites a highly revealing quote from 2012 by a prominent feminist linguist named Deborah Cameron. Speaking on a BBC radio program, she plainly stated, "We have to change language in order to change consciousness."
I want to focus on that phrase, change consciousness. How does Riker interpret what she means by that?
Riker does not view that as a benign academic theory about how language evolves over time. He sees it as a confession of deliberate ideological sabotage. He calls it linguistic colonization.
Linguistic colonization.
The premise is simple but devastating. Human beings think in words. If you can control the definitions of the words men use to describe their experiences, you can fundamentally alter what they are capable of conceptualizing.
You box them in?
You trap them in a mental cage where they cannot even articulate their own oppression because the vocabulary required to do so has been outlawed or redefined.
We have seen this happen in real time with weaponized vocabulary. Words that used to have very specific narrow meanings have been twisted into what Riker brilliantly calls cognitive landmines. And these landmines are designed exclusively to silence male expression. Let's look at the granddaddy of them all, patriarchy. How does Riker explain the inflation of that word?
He notes that originally, in anthropology and sociology, patriarchy described a very specific historical social structure where men held formal, legal, and absolute authority over family and state. But Riker argues the word has suffered grotesque, intentional definition inflation. Today, it has been stripped of its historical context and turned into a cosmic, omnipresent boogeyman.
It just means everything bad.
It is used as a catch-all excuse to blame men for literally everything, from systemic economic issues to bad weather to a woman's subjective emotional discomfort on a random Tuesday. By blaming the invisible patriarchy, the maternal state ensures women never have to take personal accountability for their own failures or choices.
Another term he dismantles is mansplaining. This one is everywhere. He notes it was coined around 2008 in an essay by Rebecca Solnit, and now it appears over 2.3 million times a year in media. What is Riker's critique of how mansplaining functions as a weapon?
Riker argues that mansplaining is no longer a critique of genuine condescension or arrogance. It has morphed into a blanket, unassailable ban on male expertise. The mechanism works like this. If a man states an objective fact, attempts to teach a complex subject, or simply corrects a factual error, and a woman feels intellectually insecure or challenged by his knowledge, she can drop the mansplaining card.
And what happens when she drops that card? Does it lead to a debate about the facts?
Never. And that is Riker's point. The accusation of mansplaining completely bypasses the factual content of what the man is saying. It attacks his right to speak at all. It instantly erases his credibility and frames his knowledge as an act of aggression. It is a linguistic tool designed to force men to apologize for being competent.
He also targets terms like toxic masculinity, male fragility, and emotional unavailability. He points out that these sound like clinical, psychological terms, but they aren't.
Exactly. I mean, that is a central part of his thesis. He argues these are not scientific diagnoses found in a medical textbook. They are linguistic traps designed to put men in an inescapable double bind. Think about the architecture of these words. If a man displays traditional strength, stoicism, and a desire to protect, he is labeled with toxic masculinity.
Right.
But if he is attacked and attempts to defend his reputation or his logic, he is immediately accused of male fragility. And if he realizes the game is rigged and decides to withdraw and remain silent, he is condemned for his emotional unavailability.
You can't win.
Riker argues that no matter what action a man takes, the language has been pre-rigged to ensure he is always in the wrong.
And it goes beyond just shaming male behavior. Riker points out that this ideology is attempting to sever language from biological reality entirely. He points to the creation of Frankenstein words. You see words like women spelled W-O-M-X-N with an X or W-O-M-Y-N with a Y. How does he view these spelling changes?
He refers to them as ideological graffiti. He argues these bizarre spellings are not about inclusivity, they are a loyalty test. They are designed to force compliance by breaking the connection between language and physical, biological reality. If you can force a man to use a nonsensical word, you have broken his adherence to objective truth.
It's a test to see if you'll bow.
Furthermore, Riker points out that if a man refuses to play along, if he points out the biological reality of what a woman is, the new linguistic rules instantly trigger a trapdoor, labeling him a bigot or transphobic, ensuring his social execution via the GSR machine.
So if these are the rules of the new language, who is enforcing them on a mass scale? According to Riker, the media acts as the PR arm, the propaganda wing, for this entire ideology. They do not report objective news. They manufacture gendered narratives to protect the maternal state. He gives some incredibly potent examples of how this media monopoly operates. Let's talk about the Andrew Tate example. Now, Tate is obviously a massive polarizing figure. How does Riker use the media's coverage of Tate to prove his point?
It is a crucial case study in how narratives supersede facts. When Andrew Tate was arrested in Romania, there was a frenzy of media coverage. Riker cites a 2023 analysis by the Reuters Institute that looked at how the media framed the story. The analysis found that an astonishing 80% of the mainstream media coverage focused entirely on Tate's misogyny, his toxic rhetoric, and his bad influence on young men.
And what was missing from that coverage?
The actual objective facts of the case. The legal charges Tate faced in Romania involve severe allegations of human trafficking, organized crime, and rape. But those objective legal realities were largely buried.
Why would the media do that? If you have a guy accused of human trafficking, why focus on his podcast quotes about women driving cars?
Because, according to Riker's thesis, the female victim narrative is what sells, and the hive mind of the BPD state cares about subjective feelings over objective legal facts. The prevailing emotional anxiety was that Tate's unapologetic, hyper-masculine posturing was dangerous to the cultural dominance of women.
So they used him as a symbol.
Riker claims that the media, which he asserts is heavily dominated by female-led editorial boards and feminist journalists, turned Tate into a conceptual boogeyman. They used him to justify their ideological rage against traditional masculinity itself, almost ignoring what the Romanian courts were actually doing. It was mass hysteria, weaponized to remind men that displaying dominant behavior will make you public enemy number one.
And it doesn't just happen to intentional provocateurs like Tate. Rikers uses the example of Matthew Walker to show that the media will destroy anyone to maintain the narrative. Walker isn't a shock jock, he's a renowned sleep scientist. What happened to him?
Matthew Walker wrote a universally praised, best-selling book on the neurological science of sleep. He was a darling of the scientific community. Then, a woman on Twitter misquoted him. She claimed that in a lecture he had referred to dreams as spiritual experiences, implying he was pushing religious dogma. In reality, he had explicitly and consistently called dreams purely neurological chemical phenomena.
But the facts didn't matter. The speed of his cancellation, as detailed in the book, was breathtaking. Walk me through the media's response to that single false tweet.
Riker details how female-led progressive media outlets like Vox, Teen Vogue, and The Cut immediately mobilized. They didn't verify the quote. They ran simultaneous hit pieces accusing Walker of pushing pseudoscience and manipulating the public. The real-world consequences were instant universities rescinded his speaking invitations, major podcasters dropped him, and his academic reputation was obliterated.
And what is the punchline to all of this? What happened when the truth came out?
Months later, the woman who started the viral rumor casually admitted on Twitter that she had misread the quote. She was wrong. But the crucial part of Riker's analysis is what didn't happen next. There were no apologies from the media outlets that destroyed him. There were no massive retractions. His speaking gigs weren't reinstated. The Me Too industrial complex, as Riker calls it, simply ignored the truth and moved on to the next target. Once the GSR machine is activated, objective logic is totally irrelevant. The destruction of the male target is the goal, regardless of his innocence.
If we pull back and look at the bigger picture, the media doesn't just destroy the men they dislike, they actively try to engineer and promote a very specific type of man that they want to normalize. Riker is absolutely vicious in his critique of what he calls the castrated archetype. Who is he talking about here?
He directs his vitriol at the media-promoted sensitive man. He specifically calls out modern celebrities who are championed by fashion magazines and pop culture. He names Timothy Chalamet, who wore a pearl earring and a harness to the Met Gala while giving interviews to GQ about dismantling toxic masculinity. He points to Harry Styles wearing dresses on the cover of Vogue. He mentions Joaquin Phoenix weeping uncontrollably at award shows.
The media frames those guys as progressive heroes, pushing boundaries. How does Riker frame them?
Riker frames them not as rebels, but as capitulating collaborators. He argues they have voluntarily traded their innate male dignity for female approval and media access. In the dogma of the maternal state, male strength is viewed as inherently suspect, male protectiveness is patronizing, and traditional male leadership is oppressive. Therefore, the media heavily rewards and enriches men who visually and behaviorally reject their biological nature, adopting a servile, aesthetically small, and non-threatening persona. Riker bluntly states that this sensitive man archetype isn't evolved, he's neutered.
And the really tragic part, according to Riker, is that a lot of average guys buy into this. They think that if they act like the sensitive, crying, vulnerable guy the media tells them to be, they will be rewarded in their personal lives. But what happens when these newly molded sensitive men try to actually date real women in this society? This brings us to a massive section of the book, exploring the complete collapse of modern dating, and what Riker calls the marriage strike.
For a listener who is actively observing or participating in the modern dating market, this section is where Riker's abstract theories hit hard, quantifiable reality. He argues that modern romance is no longer a mutual partnership based on shared values. It operates exactly like a ruthless, highly skewed pyramid scheme.
Let's look at the numbers he uses to build this case, because they are staggering. He cites a leaked 2023 internal report from the dating app Bumble. Can you break down what that data actually showed about human behavior?
The Bumble data is a perfect illustration of his premise. The internal metrics showed that 90% of female users were swiping right on only the top 10% of male profiles. And when they dug into what constituted that top 10%, women were specifically brutally filtering for the top decile of physical height, income, and educational status. Meanwhile, on the other side of the app, 78% of men were swiping right on women across a vast spectrum of average looks, average jobs, and varying educational backgrounds.
Let's pause there, because the disconnect between expectation and reality is massive.
Yeah.
How does Riker reconcile the fact that women collectively complain about being invisible or that there are no good men left when the data shows they are only acknowledging 10% of the male population?
Riker points out the intense hypocrisy of this dynamic. He notes that modern feminism continuously demands absolute egalitarian equality in the boardroom and the home. Yet, in the dating market, women rigorously and mercilessly enforce hypergamy.
For those who might not be deep into evolutionary psychology, what exactly does he mean by hypergamy in this modern context?
Hypergamy is the evolutionary biological drive for a female to seek a mate who is higher in status, wealth, and physical capability than herself. Riker argues that feminism promised equality, but women's biological instincts still demand a superior provider. So you have a vast majority of average earning women competing viciously for a tiny fraction of elite, wealthy men. In this pyramid scheme, Riker argues that women act as the incredibly demanding, unsatisfied investors at the top, while average, hardworking men are treated simply as disposable currency, invisible to the market. Mathematically, most men are guaranteed to lose.
And it isn't just about income. The physical standards are becoming cartoonish. He cites a 2022 Stanford study about height that really underscores how rigid these preferences are. What did that study find?
The Stanford study examined the mating preferences of older demographics. It found that women over the age of 35 are 4.2 times more likely to entirely reject a potential male partner simply for being shorter than them, compared to the rate at which men reject taller women. Even as women age and their fertility window closes, their physical demands on men remain inflexible.
He also ties this into social media phenomena, specifically talking about the chuggy trend. Remember this blowing up on TikTok. How does a silly internet slang word fit into a critique of systemic misandry?
Riker uses the choggy trend as a perfect, real-time example of shifting goalposts and social shaming. Choggy was a term mobilized by young millennial and Gen Z women to mock average men for being plain or slightly out of touch wearing cargo shorts, liking mainstream movies, or using outdated slang. Riker points out the malicious contradiction. At the exact same time these women are mocking average guys for being basic, they are publishing articles insisting that men must spend exorbitant amounts of money on intensive therapy, fashion consultants, bespoke gym memberships, and dating coaches just to be deemed minimally acceptable for a coffee date.
It's an endless tightrope. Be confident, but don't be arrogant. Be completely open with your deepest traumas, but don't be clingy or dump your emotional labor on her.
Precisely. Riker argues these aren't genuine standards for a healthy relationship. They are control mechanisms designed to keep men off balance. And when men inevitably fall short of these contradictory demands, women don't offer grace or help. They take to the internet to mock them, activating the gossip network to humiliate them publicly.
Okay, so let's play out a hypothetical. Let's say a guy actually navigates this minefield. He hits the gym, makes a great salary, lands in that top 10%, gets married, and buys the house. What is waiting for him on the other side? According to the book, it is the ultimate trap, the divorce machine. The reality of family courts is depicted as incredibly grim. Let's start with who is actually pulling the plug on these marriages.
Riker highlights a widely acknowledged statistical reality. Women initiate somewhere between 70 to 80% of all divorces in the United States.
And how does he interpret that? Because the cultural narrative is usually that women file for divorce because men are cheating or abusive or failing to help around the house.
Riker rejects that narrative entirely. He argues that the legal system has been engineered to financially incentivize women to break their vows. He claims that women initiate divorce because they know the family courts will allow them to use their children as leverage, walk away with exorbitant alimony, seize the primary residence, and secure child support, all while being praised by their social circle as brave victims escaping a stifling situation. He describes the family court system as a weapons factory, designed specifically to extract every penny of wealth a man has built and shred every ounce of his dignity.
He shares an anecdote here that is truly mind-blowing, involving a man in Portland. It perfectly illustrates how the BPD state logic, where feelings trump facts, has infected the divorce courts. Tell me about the socks.
The book details the divorce proceedings of a man in Portland. He had a stable, high-earning job, paid the mortgage consistently, and there was no history of physical abuse or infidelity. But his wife filed for divorce and demanded the house and 6 figures in alimony, her primary piece of evidence. She told the judge that her husband frequently left his dirty socks on the bedroom floor.
I mean, that's annoying, but it's laundry. How does that become legal grounds for destroying a man's financial life?
Because of the linguistic hijack we discussed earlier, the wife didn't say, "I am annoyed by the laundry." She used the weaponized vocabulary of the maternal state. She testified that the socks on the floor made her feel emotionally unsafe and that they were a symbol of his systemic male indifference to her lived experience.
And the judge bought it.
According to Riker, the court agreed completely. The judge granted her the house, the alimony, and even ordered the husband to attend mandatory behavioral therapy for emotional neglect. Riker uses this horrific example to prove his core thesis. When subjective feeling trumps objective fact in a court of law, socks on the floor aren't just laundry anymore, they are legally actionable evidence of abuse. He calls it hormonal tyranny dressed up as jurisprudence.
Which brings us to what is undoubtedly the most controversial, polarizing part of Riker's entire book. His take on motherhood versus lifestyle. Again, keeping our strict impartiality, we must examine how Riker frames the modern feminist approach to biology, because he does not hold back. How does he view the way modern women approach having children?
Riker argues that modern women have committed a profound societal betrayal by abandoning what he views as their most sacred biological and evolutionary duty, motherhood. He claims they have traded the profound responsibility of raising the next generation for a shallow boutique lifestyle choice he calls self-actualization. He paints a picture of a culture where women chase corporate status, international travel, cosmetic surgery, and fleeting emotional intensity, while viewing the sacrifices of family as oppressive.
He specifically dives into the topic of abortion here, and his framing is incredibly harsh. How does he categorize it within his broader theory of the BPD state?
He characterizes the abortion of nearly 1/8 of the global population over the last few decades not as a necessary healthcare right for cases of extreme poverty, medical emergency, or trauma. He frames it as a mechanism of sheer sociopathic convenience. He argues that women have turned abortion into a holy sacrament, specifically to avoid the consequences of their actions and maintain their status as eternal infants who hold no responsibilities.
And how does he connect that back to men? Because a feminist argument would say, my body, my choice, has nothing to do with him.
Riker points out the brutal economic contradiction. He argues that the sociopathic element of this system is that women demand the absolute right to avoid family responsibilities, yet they simultaneously demand that men, the very men they are rejecting, divorcing, and alienating in the dating market, subsidize these independent lifestyle choices through massive taxation and the funding of the welfare state.
So he's saying the maternal instinct hasn't vanished, it has just been fertilized. Instead of nurturing actual children, women are nurturing their own perpetual victimhood and demanding that the state act as their uncomplaining provider. And men are looking at this incredibly hostile landscape where they are expected to work, bleed, and pay for a system that openly despises them, and they are simply walking away. The marriage strike isn't a coordinated protest. It is thousands of individual men looking at the math, looking at the legal risks of family court, and decided to opt out of the game entirely.
Exactly. Which leads us to the ultimate question of the book. If the institutions are fully captured, if the language is hijacked so you can't even argue back, and if the legal system and the dating market are literal traps, what is the solution? What does Riker propose his readers actually do? How do they break the spell?
Let's move into our final section, the path back. Riker introduces a philosophical concept he calls praxa. What is praxa, and how does it combat the hysteria of the BPD state?
Praxa is a term Riker uses to describe the practical, uncompromising application of truth. It is the active antidote to emotional manipulation. He argues that before men can change the world, they must first prepare their own minds. They must restore what he calls epistemic hygiene.
Epistemic hygiene. Break that down for me. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, right? How we know what is true. So what does hygiene look like in that context?
Riker cites fascinating psychological research from University College London to explain this. The researchers found that prolonged exposure to high emotion, repetitive feminist or progressive rhetoric actually increases cognitive rigidity in individuals.
Wait, so it actually makes people less open-minded?
Yes, according to Riker's interpretation of the data, people stop thinking critically, they stop analyzing arguments, and instead start automatically reciting pre-programmed slogans like "believe women" or "check your privilege," almost like cult initiates responding to a bell. Epistemic hygiene means actively, aggressively cleaning your mind of these ideological viruses. It requires a return to the classical trivium grammar, logic, and rhetoric. It means looking at a situation, identifying the objective facts, and absolutely refusing to accept terror, blackmail, or emotional distress as a substitute for a valid, logical argument. It is like installing antivirus software for your brain.
And he notes that men are already organically doing this by reclaiming language. You hear terms in the manosphere like red pill, frame control, and sigma male. A mainstream critic would just dismiss those as toxic internet buzzwords. How does Riker view them?
He views them as essential intellectual armor. When a man declares he has taken the red pill, he is not just adopting a movie reference. He is making a profound philosophical declaration that he sees the matrix of the maternal state, he recognizes the manipulation, and he is fully awake. When a man talks about maintaining frame control, he is consciously practicing the refusal to be swept into a woman's emotional chaos. Riker isn't selling a new religion to replace feminism. He views these terms as men fighting a guerrilla war of meaning, trying to invent the vocabulary they need to survive.
And this individual mental awakening is starting to coalesce into something larger. Riker talks about the formation of what he calls the brotherhood of logic. He points out that men are no longer just suffering in isolation, drinking themselves to death in silence. They are actively opting out of the captured corporate and state systems and building entirely new parallel networks. Where is he seeing this happen?
He highlights the explosive, undeniable growth of independent, male-centric forums and digital spaces. He mentions massive communities like the subreddits r/menslive or sprawling websites like A Voice for Men. He notes that A Voice for Men routinely pulls in over 5 million unique visitors a month.
5 million men a month seeking this out. What are they doing in these spaces that they can't do in mainstream society?
They are speaking freely. These spaces are self-organized, largely immune to corporate HR censorship, and entirely free of diversity, equity, and inclusion mandates. Men are gathering to debate philosophy, discuss physical fitness, share legal strategies for surviving family court, and mentor each other on fatherhood. Furthermore, he points to the rise of highly vetted, private, real-world networks. He mentions groups he has interviewed, like the Pro-Feminist Network and Real Men Rise. In these private enclaves, men are literally detoxing from decades of psychological manipulation. They're realizing, often for the first time, that the constant tears and crises of their partners weren't genuine expressions of vulnerability, but calculated mechanisms of control.
So what is Riker's ultimate call to action? He isn't telling men to march on Washington or run for office in a rigged system. He is calling for a return to stoicism. What are the rules of engagement for this new parallel society he wants men to build?
His call to action is a demand for radical, uncompromising accountability and a total, unapologetic rejection of female-coded rules of engagement. He tells men to stop whining about the system, stop trying to explain yourself to people who hate you, stop apologizing for your innate male nature. He demands they rebuild communities based purely on objective facts, merit, and logic.
He lays down some very hard, specific rules for how these spaces must operate if they're going to survive.
Yes, he mandates strict operational hygiene for these new networks. No gossip allowed, no shaming campaigns, no rallying against a target without absolute proof. In professional settings, no crying in meetings, no tone policing text messages. If someone attempts to use the cry-bully tactic on you, you do not comfort them, you turn around and walk away. You completely refuse to participate in any system, relationship, or corporation that treats you as a disposable resource or a presumed predator.
He actually points to a historical example to prove that this works. He tells a story from 1963 about a group of Alpha Phi Alpha brothers at a university. Tell me how they handled an influx of emotionalism.
According to the book, these fraternity brothers realized that their prestigious intercollegiate debate society was being degraded. New members were trying to win arguments using emotional appeals, personal sob stories, and claims of victimhood rather than rigorous logic. The older brothers saw the danger. They stepped in and ruthlessly reinstated strict formal rules of evidence, time limits, and objective rebuttal. If you cried, you forfeited your time.
And what was the result? Did everyone quit because it was too harsh?
The exact opposite. Once the emotional chaos was banned and clear, objective laws boundaries were restored, their enrollment tripled within 2 semesters. Riker uses this to assert a fundamental truth about male psychology. Men crave structure, meritocracy, and fair rules. They want to know how to win based on their actual abilities. The modern state has denied them that structure, and Riker is telling men they have the power and the duty to build it for themselves.
This brings us to a profound, provocative final thought for you, the listener, to mull over as we conclude. Riker paints a meticulous, clarifying picture of a society where the very concepts of language, law, and core institutions have fundamentally fractured along gender lines. The definitions of justice, truth, and responsibility are no longer shared between men and women. If Riker's architecture is accurate, if the trust between the sexes at an institutional level is entirely broken and replaced by a cold, zero-sum war for resources, how can future generations possibly hope to negotiate a shared reality? Is a completely parallel, decoupled society where men build their own untouchable economic and social networks away from the maternal state the only logical conclusion? Or is there some undiscovered way to bridge this unprecedented ideological chasm before the civilization collapses entirely from within, as Riker warns it inevitably will?
That is an incredibly heavy question. It is the kind of question that forces you to confront the reality of the world you are living in, regardless of where you initially stand on the political spectrum.
And that is going to do it for our deep dive today. Thank you so much for sticking with us through this intense, granular breakdown. Please remember to take a second to like and subscribe to the show so we know you want more of these rigorous, unflinching explorations into complex ideas.
And as a final reminder, the source material for today's deep dive was the ebook Out of Control, Female Hysteria, Female Supremacy, and Axis of Misandrous Ideologies by Conrad Riker.
I highly encourage you to head over to Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play Books right now to purchase your own copy and examine his data and arguments for yourself. And don't forget to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to stay updated on his ongoing research. Until next time, keep questioning the narrative and stay curious.